The night was silent, except for the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. A cool breeze swept across the empty highway, rustling the dry grass along the roadside. Then, flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness. Officer Daniels adjusted his belt, feeling the familiar weight of his holstered weapon. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the adrenaline rush that came with power. He loved this moment, the moment before control was established. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the blacked-out SUV, his boots crunching against the gravel. The tinted window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man in a crisp, dark uniform. The dim glow of the patrol car's headlights cast sharp shadows across the driver's face. No fear, no panic, just an eerie calm. Daniel squared his shoulders. This guy thinks he's above the law. License and registration, he barked, tapping his fingers against the grip of his pistol. The driver exhaled slowly. His voice was steady, filled with a quiet authority that sent a chill up Daniel's spine. "Officer," the man said, locking eyes with him, "do you have any idea who I am?" Daniel's fingers twitched. Something about the man's tone felt off, like he was the one in control. For the first time in his career, Daniels hesitated. Officer Daniels had been with the force for nearly a decade. In that time, he'd made plenty of stops like this one. A black man in an expensive car driving through his town at night. Most of the time, they complied, lowering their heads, knowing better than to challenge his authority. But this man, he wasn't scared. Daniels narrowed his eyes, scanning the SUV's interior. Clean. No fast food wrappers, no signs of intoxication. Just an orderly precision that made him uneasy. The man's posture was too rigid, his expression too unreadable. "I said license and registration," Daniels repeated, this time sharper. The man didn't move. Daniels' jaw tightened. This was the part where they either fumbled for their wallet or got defensive. This guy did neither. "Step out of the vehicle," Daniels snapped, hand hovering over his gun. Still no movement. Daniels could feel his pulse in his throat. Was this guy messing with him? His fingers curled around the grip of his pistol. "I said—" The man slowly turned his head, his eyes steady and unshaken. Then in a voice so calm it sent a chill through Daniels' spine, he said, "I'm General Marcus Johnson. If you pull that trigger, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Daniel's grip tightened, but for the first time, his confidence wavered. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears, his fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. General Marcus Johnson didn't move. He just sat there, calm, unwavering, completely unafraid. Daniels hated that look, that quiet defiance. His training told him that hesitation was a weakness. If a suspect didn't comply, you forced them to. "Step out of the vehicle now," Daniels barked, his voice cracking slightly. Johnson didn't blink. Then in the distance, sirens, back up. Daniels exhaled sharply, his grip firm. Good. Now he had numbers. The first patrol car screeched to a halt behind him. Officer Reynolds, a younger cop, jumped out, his hand hovering over his own holster. "What's the situation?" Reynolds asked cautiously. Daniels didn't take his eyes off Johnson. Uncooperative suspect. Might be reaching for something. Reynolds glanced inside the SUV. Johnson's hands were in plain sight. No sudden movements. No aggression. Something felt wrong. Just then, a crackled voice broke through the police radio. "Hold fire! Hold fire! Do not engage!" Daniels frowned. That wasn't standard protocol. Then, a second voice. Captain Morrison, his superior. "Daniels, stand down immediately." "That's General Johnson." "Repeat, stand down." Daniels' stomach twisted. "General?" Reynolds took a step back. "Sir, maybe we should—" Daniels snapped, "I've got this under control." But the doubt had already taken root. The sound of murmuring voices made Daniels turn. People were gathering. First, just a few. Drivers, who had pulled over to watch. Then more. Phones were up, recording. Daniels clenched his teeth. Great. The last thing he needed was another viral video twisting the story. He turned back to Johnson. Out of the car, last warning. Johnson exhaled deeply, as if debating whether to humor the officer. But instead of complying, he finally spoke. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Daniels' face flushed red. "You're resisting arrest." "I'm sitting in my vehicle. That's not resisting." Daniels' jaw locked. He had made too many mistakes already tonight. He couldn't back down now. More voices on the police radio. "This is a bad stop. General Marcus Johnson, Army Special Operations, 4 tours overseas. That man is a damn war hero." The words hit Daniels like a gut punch. A war hero? For the first time, Daniels really looked at the man in front of him. He wasn't some arrogant businessman. He wasn't a thug or a troublemaker. He was a leader, a soldier, a decorated general. And Daniels was treating him like a criminal. More sirens. A third car pulled up, a black SUV, not another patrol car. Daniels' stomach twisted when he saw who stepped out. Sheriff Tom Bennett. Bennett wasn't just Daniels' boss. He ran the whole damn town. And if there was anyone who could have his back, it was Bennett. Except his face was stone cold as he walked toward them. Daniels turned, desperate for backup. "Sheriff, this man is resisting." Bennett ignored him. Instead, he locked eyes with General Johnson. Then he did something Daniels didn't expect. He saluted. Daniels' throat went dry. The sheriff turned to him, voice low, sharp, and full of warning. "You don't know who you just messed with." Daniels suddenly felt very, very small. The air felt suffocating. The weight of flashing lights, roaring whispers from the crowd, and the cold grip of reality pressed down on Officer Daniels like a vice. His fingers twitched against the handle of his gun, his career hanging by a thread. Sheriff Bennett's words echoed in his skull. "You don't know who you just messed with." Daniel's mouth was dry. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He had to take control. Step outside. Office. The car. His voice cracked slightly. The crowd fell silent. For a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then the door opened. The hush deepened as General Marcus Johnson finally emerged. He stepped out of the SUV slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. His uniform, though partially hidden beneath a black coat, still bore the insignia of a high-ranking military official. His stature was commanding, his face unreadable. There was no fear, no hesitation, only control. Daniels took an involuntary step back. He had made a mistake, a big one. The phones were still recording. Everything was captured. The realization crashed down on him. This wasn't some random nobody he could intimidate into submission. This was a decorated general, a man respected far beyond this small-town police force. Daniels' hands began to shake. This was it. His career, his badge, his entire future hung in the balance. Johnson squared his shoulders, his piercing eyes locking onto Daniels. "I suggest you put that gun away, officer. You're in far too deep." Daniels couldn't move. Then a gunshot rang out. The crowd screamed as the gunshot shattered the thick tension in the air. Daniels flinched, but it wasn't his shot. His head snapped to the right, toward the source. Standing just behind the police vehicles, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark uniform held a smoking gun in his grip. Chief Inspector Warren, the highest-ranking officer in the county, and his gun was aimed directly at General Johnson. For a split second, no one moved. Johnson hadn't flinched. He stood there, his gaze locked on Warren, as if the bullet that had just been fired had never existed. Daniels, however, felt like his entire chest had been caved in. What the hell just happened? Chief Warren took a slow step forward, his voice calm but laced with venom. "General Johnson, I strongly suggest you get back in that vehicle and drive away." Johnson didn't budge, didn't even blink. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. The tension had shifted. This was no longer just about a bad traffic stop. This was something bigger. Daniels finally understood. This wasn't just about him stopping the wrong man. There was a larger game being played, and he was just a pawn in it. Daniels swallowed hard, his hands clammy. His world was spinning out of control. Sheriff Bennett took a step forward, his voice dangerously low. "Warren, stand down." But Warren didn't even look at him. His gun remained steady, unwavering, aimed at the general's chest. Johnson exhaled slowly, then spoke. "I see." His voice was calm, controlled, but razor sharp. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Warren." Daniels felt sick. What was going on? And then the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This was a setup, and he had just been a useful idiot. His pulse roared in his ears as Warren's finger tightened on the trigger. For the first time in his life, Officer Daniels had to make a choice. Was he really on the right side? The air was thick with silence, the kind that made every second feel like an eternity. Officer Daniels's mouth was dry, his fingers trembling near his holster. His whole life, he'd believed the badge meant something, that it stood for justice, law, and order. Now, as he watched Chief Warren aim his weapon at a decorated war hero, Daniels wasn't so sure anymore. This isn't right. The whispers in the crowd had morphed into shouts. Some called out Johnson's name, others screamed for answers. Warren didn't flinch. His gun was steady, his eyes dark with something far worse than arrogance, certainty. Sheriff Bennett took a slow step forward, his voice razor sharp. "Warren, lower your damn weapon." But Warren remained stone-faced. Then, in a voice as cold as steel, he spoke. "General Johnson, I'm giving you one last chance. Walk away." Johnson exhaled slowly, his hands still at his sides. "We both know that's not happening." Warren's jaw tensed. Daniels felt the weight of the moment crushing him. If Warren pulled the trigger, the body cams, the phones in the crowd, they would all capture it. The world would see a police chief execute a war hero in cold blood. Daniels had seen his fair share of incidents, brushed under the rug. But this? There was no hiding this. And then, out of nowhere, "He's covering up something big." The voice came from behind. Daniels turned to see Officer Reynolds, his young colleague, stepping forward, his face pale. "Chief, don't do this." Reynolds' voice was shaky. "We both know why you want him dead." Warren's eyes flickered, his grip tightening. "Walk away, Reynolds. Now." But Reynolds didn't. He took another step forward. "I saw the files." Daniels' stomach dropped. "What files?" he asked cautiously. Reynolds turned to him, his voice hushed. "Johnson knows something. Something they want buried." Daniels looked at the general. Johnson didn't deny it. "You're bluffing." Warren's voice was sharp, but Daniels could see it. The moment of hesitation. Reynolds pressed forward. The missing reports, the illegal seizures, the informants that just vanished. Daniels' skin went cold. Warren had been on the force longer than anyone. He had contacts higher up. Daniels always thought the chief operated in the gray. But this was something else. Daniels looked at Johnson again. His calm wasn't arrogance. It was experience. This wasn't the first time he had been a target. And then the final piece clicked into place. Johnson wasn't just a general. He was intelligence, a man who had seen things the government wanted erased. Daniels felt the blood drain from his face. They weren't just trying to kill a man. They were trying to erase a witness. Daniels took a slow step back, his head spinning. If Johnson died right now, what would happen next? Think. The phone recordings, the body cams, the radio chatter. What would the department say? That Johnson was aggressive? That he resisted? That they had no choice? And Daniels? He was the arresting officer. If Warren needed someone to take the fall, Daniels was the perfect scapegoat. "I'm being set up." His pulse thundered. Johnson had known it from the moment he was pulled over. Daniels turned back to Warren, his stomach twisted in knots. If he didn't act now, he was either going to end up dead or locked away. He had two choices. Do nothing. Let Warren pull the trigger and hope he wasn't blamed. Make a move, but once he crossed that line, there was no going back. Daniel's breath hitched, and then something unexpected happened. A phone buzzed in Johnson's pocket. He ignored it, but Daniels saw the name that flashed on the screen, unknown caller. Then a second later, a message popped up. You need to move. Now? Johnson finally reacted. For the first time since the traffic stop began, a shadow of uncertainty crossed his face. Daniels frowned. Who is that? Johnson didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step toward Warren, speaking low, just for him. You really think you're the one in control here? Daniels barely caught the look that flickered across Warren's face, a look that could only mean one thing: fear. Whoever was on the other end of that message was bigger than Warren, and they were watching. Daniels felt a shift in the air. Warren was running out of time. If this was a cover-up, it was falling apart in real time. Daniels turned toward Johnson, still uncertain. Who the hell are you, really? Johnson looked at him, really looked at him. Then he answered, the only person keeping you alive right now. Daniels swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. Daniels had spent his entire career believing in loyalty to the badge, that the chain of command was absolute. But now he saw the truth for what it was. They didn't care about him. They never did. This wasn't about law and order. It was about power. And General Marcus Johnson was a threat to that power. It all happened fast. Sheriff Bennett, Johnson, and Daniels had moved quickly, leaving the chaos at the traffic stop behind. They needed to get to Warren's office. Now Bennett used his key card, bypassing the security system, and they burst through the door. Chief Warren was already inside, standing behind his desk, calm but visibly tense. His gun was still in its holster, but his fingers were twitching. Daniels felt his pulse spike. This was it. Johnson stepped forward, his presence commanding as ever. We both know why you pulled that gun, Warren. His voice was ice. You wanted to silence me before this got out. Warren scoffed, shaking his head. You're paranoid, General. Am I? Johnson pulled out his phone, holding up the screen, a classified file. Daniels didn't know what was in it, but Warren did, because his face drained of color the second he saw it. He was caught. How the hell did you get that? Warren hissed. You should be more careful about who you trust. Johnson's grip tightened on the phone. Daniels felt the tension coil tighter. They had him. But then, Warren moved fast. In a flash, his gun was out, aimed directly at Johnson. But Johnson was faster. Before Warren could pull the trigger, the general pivoted, his military reflexes kicking in. The gun went off. Bang! The bullet barely missed Johnson, shattering a framed certificate on the wall. Daniels reacted purely on instinct. For the first time in his life, he wasn't following orders. He was breaking them. He lunged for Warren's arm, grappling for control of the gun. Warren was strong, but Daniels was desperate. He wrestled for control, his training taking over. And then, a sickening crack. Warren screamed as Johnson twisted his wrist in a perfectly executed disarm maneuver. The gun clattered to the floor. Johnson moved swiftly, grabbing Warren by the collar and slamming him onto the desk. The chief of police, completely overpowered. His face contorted with rage, but there was no escape. Daniel stood there, breathing heavily, staring at his boss, his former boss, pinned beneath Johnson's grip. This was it. The moment he had to choose. He could still pretend this never happened. He could still cover for Warren, spin the story, say Johnson had resisted, or he could end it right here. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the police radio. He hesitated only for a second. Then he pressed the button. This is Officer Daniels. I have Chief Warren in custody for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The line exploded with chatter. The department wasn't ready for this, but it was too late now. Johnson looked at him finally, a sign of respect in his eyes. Daniels had made his choice. He was done protecting the wrong people. As sirens closed in, Johnson finally released Warren, letting him slump against the desk. The once powerful chief now looked small, weak, defeated. Johnson leaned in close, his voice low but piercing. "You spent years thinking you were untouchable, that you could silence the truth." He held up the classified document on his phone one last time. "But tonight, the truth is silenced you." Warren's face twisted in rage, but it was over. Daniels had never felt so free, and for the first time in years, he finally understood what justice really meant. The news cycle exploded the next morning. Police chief arrested in corruption scandal. General Marcus Johnson exposes deep-seated cover-up. Brave officer blows the whistle, at a cost. The footage from the traffic stop, the confession from Reynolds, and the classified documents leaked by Johnson had spread like wildfire. There was no hiding it anymore. Chief Warren was hauled away in handcuffs, his once feared presence reduced to nothing. Daniels sat alone in his apartment watching the coverage on repeat. Every news anchor called him a hero for turning on his own boss. But he didn't feel like one. He'd spent years enforcing a system that protected men like Warren. He had blindly followed orders, believing he was on the right side. Until the night he almost shot the wrong man, until the night he saw the truth. His badge sat on the table in front of him, the symbol of everything he once believed in. Slowly, deliberately, he picked it up and set it down for the last time. Daniels had made his choice. He wasn't a cop anymore. Far away, General Marcus Johnson stood at attention in his office, staring at a map filled with classified reports. This wasn't the end. He had exposed one corrupt force, but the rot ran deeper. He glanced at the files in front of him. More names, more crimes. Johnson knew one thing for certain. His war wasn't over. Daniel sat on his couch, the glow of the TV flickering across his face. The news played another clip from the night before. A still frame of General Johnson standing tall under flashing police lights. Daniel stared at it, his mind flooded with what-ifs. What if he had pulled the trigger? What if Johnson had died? What if he had never questioned the system at all? The screen faded to black. Daniels exhaled, gripping his hands together. Some regrets never fade. The screen fades to black, leaving only the faint echo of sirens in the distance. Then, a single image appears, a surveillance photo of Officer Daniels, months after he left the force, unshaven, a man with haunted eyes. A reporter's voice cuts in. In a shocking turn of events, former Officer Daniels has been spotted in Washington, D.C., meeting with federal investigators. Could this be the beginning of an even bigger case? The screen freezes on Daniels' conflicted face. Then, a slow fade to text. Before I reveal what happened to Daniels after this explosive case, hit subscribe, because you won't believe how this story ends.